in when they start to cross a boundary. We also want to help you lessen the amount of power struggles that you're experiencing in your home, or be prepared that if a power struggle comes, how to respond so that you don't have those in the future. So we started with a little bit of where we're at, and we like to really ground ourselves in the why of why you are here today. So we know that there's lots of other things that you could have done with this hour between your either it's your lunch break or maybe downtime, or maybe you're still doing all the things and you've just got us in your ears. Just wanted to ground yourself in why you chose to come today. So this will just be an individual think time. You don't have to share with anyone, but just thinking about when you saw something about healthy boundaries or you saw this parent learning series, why did you choose to show up today? So I'll give it just a moment of think time. And I know as Lexi and I created this, we create this very humbly, knowing that this is something that we all struggle with, is setting healthy boundaries. And, our why is just to help support families. And also, I think we learned a little bit. We were just chatting before we started about how, being a parent, or I'm an auntie, and how these are really challenging, even if we have practice at it every day. So I think we even learned something as we were practicing and preparing for this training. So we hope that you as well do. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lexi to start talking a little bit about boundaries.
Okay, so the first step in really setting boundaries is we have to know what our boundaries are. And sometimes we inherently know those, and sometimes we don't really think about them because we've just been doing things for so long that it's kind of like second nature to us. So your first step is really know what your boundaries are, and then really think of that in the context of your family culture, because every family operates differently. And so my family's boundaries might be very different from Lindsay's family's boundaries, and that's totally fine. You just have to do what works best for you and your family, and then make sure that your family as a unit are all agreeing on those boundaries. So for example, like a family might prioritize educational achievement, right? Whereas another family might emphasize the family unit and making decisions together as a family. So it's really important to really think about what those are going to be before you start talking to your children about what boundaries are and how we're going to teach our kids what those are. Some other examples of like knowing your boundaries is knowing what your boundaries are in curfews. What's your boundary on technology? That's a really big one in today's society. And also, what are your boundaries on communication, and how do you want to communicate with your family and your children? So if we know our boundaries, we need to teach our boundaries. And one of the funniest things is that sometimes we think that kids know boundaries, and they don't. So a funny example is our kids know that we can't go to the bathroom in the living room. Why? Because we taught them directly. We taught them a lot of times that, hey, if you go in the bathroom, you get some sort of reward for this, right? Or you get praise, you get that. And so they learn that, okay, this is where I want to go. I do not want to go in the living room because that results in a consequence or a outcome that I don't like, right? Usually us as parents being a little upset because we have to clean that up. And so that is something to really think about, is how are we going to teach our kids, directly teach them some of our boundaries that are a little bit harder for kids to pick up on just naturally. So the next few sets of slides that we're going to go through really are going to set the stage for that, of like, how do we teach boundaries? So this slide has a lot of different things on it. And right now I'm going to go over just a quick overview of how you teach boundaries. So the first one is you model them. And you don't have to do this, like I don't have to sit there and say, okay, I have a 4 and a 7-year-old. Both of my kids sit down so that I can model this particular behavior. No, I can do it naturally in my interactions with my kids, or in my interactions with my partner or other people that we're around. It's how you respond and show and demonstrate those boundaries. So A funny example from last night in my own personal family is that I was very irritated with my spouse, and I was talking with my son. We were in the same room as him, and I said, "I'm really irritated with dad right now, and I really want to hit something. Should I hit something?" And my son said, "No, you should take some deep breaths, right?" And so we practiced that. I was very honest, and I was very irritated with dad, but I was fixing the situation and modeling, like, here's my boundary and here's how I have to teach this. And let's talk about how I could handle my frustration better. Um, Explaining the why. Why is it important that we have these boundaries? For older kids, when we're talking about technology, it's really important to say why. Why am I not allowing you potentially to be on this social media site? Or why do you need to be really careful when you're navigating through the internet? Letting kids know the why behind it can sometimes help with the buy-in. Using role playing, so kids love to pretend to be parents. So have them role play can really help them understand, like, if you were in this situation, how would you handle that? Or be the brother or the sister or the other sibling, and really set them up for that. That's also helpful. Encouraging self-awareness. So really teaching your kids that they need to see what feels good to them. How does it feel when someone does this? What are your limits? What do you want a friend to do or say? And then that's a boundary that you set with your friends. So be aware of how things feel. And you can always tell your kids, how does that feel? And that's a great way to teach self-awareness. Teaching communication skills. So practicing phrases that kids can use with them. I don't like that. Please stop. Those are phrases that tell somebody that you've crossed the line and this is my boundary. Also, always discussing respect for others. We want to respect others' personal space, their feelings, and all of those things. On the other side, there's a bunch of different things. I don't want to take up too much time and go over all these, but setting family boundaries together can be really helpful to have discussions as a family unit and say, okay, what are my boundaries? Sometimes within a family unit, different people might have different boundaries, right? Mom might have one, dad might have one, grandma, grandpa, whoever is part of that family unit, they might have some different boundaries. And so really talking about that and working on those together can help everybody understand and respect those boundaries. It's always really important to provide positive reinforcement for our kids when they do meet the boundaries and they do these things that we're asking them to do. Especially for younger kids, we're not intrinsically motivated. We are extrinsically motivated a lot when we're younger to do things. Think about when you're teaching boundaries, just in the back of your mind, how am I going to handle when my child doesn't actually adhere to that boundary? What are my steps going to be? Because we know that we're still learning, even as adults, we violate boundaries. And so how am I going to respond to that in a way that'll be supportive of my child learning that boundary and then hopefully following it in the future? Always encourage reflection about what happened, the situation, why might this boundary be important to follow, things like that. And then being really patient and consistent. It is really a long game parenting children, and it's hard, and we all lose our patience at times, and it's hard to be consistent because we've got a lot going on. But the more consistent you are in saying this is the boundary and holding to it, is going to help in the long run for your child to really internalize that boundary and make sure that they are respecting that. And then as kids get older, boundaries change. And so really thinking through as they're developing through those different developmental stages, what needs to change at this point in time and what new boundaries may need to be set. So here is a slide with a lot of different types of boundaries on it. And really there's tons and tons of things. And sometimes we don't think about all of these. Some quick examples are like physical boundaries. So personal space and privacy. Emotional boundaries, like how do you express your feelings to somebody? What words do you use? What tone do you use? We all know the digital ones. There's lots of, but screen time, what social media sites you can use, where the computer is located, all of those types of things. And then social boundaries of how we interact in different situations with other people. So these are just things to think about as you're thinking about what are my boundaries, what do I want to teach to my children. There's lots that you can really come up with if you sit down and think about it. And we don't always think about that because we're so busy. And one of the most important things when we're teaching boundaries to children is what we call clear is kind. So if you keep this in your mind, instead of saying, no, stop that, don't do that, tell your child what you expect. So if I want my son to not kick people, I will say, we're going to keep our hands and our feet to ourselves. That's safe. That's kind. And really being clear and being kind and teaching the child what you want to see instead of saying no, don't, and stop helps them learn what the boundary is and what to do instead of whatever the behavior was that they were doing. And it also really empowers kids. It lets them express their needs. It shows them, that there are limits on what we can do. And you can give them phrases. You can say, I need space. I need time alone. I need a break, right? Instead of hitting your sister, you say, I need space from you. Instead of yelling, like, I need to take a break, right? And so those are replacements for the behavior that we don't want to see. And this is what we do want to see. So always being really clear with your children. And also, the older they get, the more you can explain why, what is this boundary about, and what could you do instead of that.
Thanks, Lexi. Yeah, I love this clear as kind because I really think sometimes we get in the no don'ts and the stops and really, again, trying to say, what do we want to see so that we are telling them exactly what to do, not what not to do. So thanks, Lexi, for that. So what we're going to do now is Lexi really led us into that idea of what are our expectations around our boundaries, how are we setting those, and how are we teaching those. And she touched on this a little bit about how are we then going to ensure that our child continues to follow those expectations and those boundaries. And so we want to start looking at ways to acknowledge when our kids are following those directions. So we have a quote or some information here about positive reinforcement. And so it's really allowing your child, once we are clear and we're telling them exactly what we want to see them do, we've maybe practiced it or we've modeled it, we want to ensure that we are then telling them that this is exactly what we want you to do and we want you to continue that. So positive reinforcement helps your child feel good about themselves. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that can look like in your home and things and strategies to help continue your child following those boundaries. And don't worry, we will get to what happens if they don't follow those boundaries. But again, we always want to be proactive as much as possible so that when we do have to react, we're more prepared. So we think it's important to start with the difference between bribery and positive reinforcement. And oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh, I bribed them to do this, or positive reinforcement is bribery. And so we thought it'd be important to just start with this idea of what is the difference between bribery and positive reinforcement. So bribery is offering something to try to stop or influence behavior in the moment. It's more reactionary. It occurs after maybe we've seen a problem or something our child has crossed our boundary. So it's if you stop doing this, then I can give you this, right? It's really more reactive to what they're doing in that moment. It often stops the behavior in the short term, which feels good to us as the adults. However, in the long term, it's not as effective as positive reinforcement because what's ultimately happening is your child or children are learning that, well, if I just do this, then that's when mom or dad or auntie or grandma, grandpa make that deal with me. So I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And I know that eventually I'll get something good out of it. And oftentimes we say it's favorable to the person giving the bribe because, again, it gets the child to stop what we're doing. I always think about the example of the child screaming in the grocery store. I've definitely been there with my nephews where I'm just like, oh my gosh, if I could get them to stop because all the eyes are on me, I'm feeling stressed. I probably needed to, take a breath, like Lexi said earlier, really needing to calm myself down. But instead, I'm like, if you just stop right now, I'll give you the sucker at the checkout stand, right? So I'm seeing this behavior and I'm telling them to stop, and then I'll give them something later. That's bribery. Now, we do it a lot. I know I'm guilty, and we just want to be aware that that is what it is. And so we just want to start thinking about maybe in that moment we had to do that reaction, but how are we then going to set that boundary of here's how we behave in the store and this is what I expect in the store. And if you follow that expectation, then this is what you can get. So again, being more proactive. It's very slight difference, but again, it's before I enter the store, I'm setting that boundary of what I expect and I'm letting them know what we're going to do and we're going to talk about it and how it's going to look in the store and then they can get the sucker at the checkout versus they're screaming in the checkout line and I'm giving and telling them if you stop right now, I'll give this to you. So again, it's very, very slight difference, but again, being more proactive than reactive. So positive reinforcement has that clear expectation of how to earn that thing that they're going to get, whether it's extra time, and we'll talk about some ideas, or if it is that sucker. Again, we're providing it what they say contingently, right? So after they show us that they followed our boundary or they followed that expectation. And ultimately, it's a long term. And as Lexi said, parenting is a long term game, or caregiving is a long term game. And really thinking about it's increasing and strengthening and maintaining those behaviors for long term. So, again, bribery helps us in that moment, but positive reinforcement helps us in the long term. So, we want to really try to utilize positive reinforcement and setting those things up proactively versus using that bribery, which is more reactive. So one of the most important things about reinforcement is that it is unique to the person. So I could tell you that there's probably some things that Lexi and I both like that would reward our behavior, that would make us want to do something and follow boundaries that people have set for us. But there's also things that maybe Lexi likes that I actually just despise. So it's different for everyone. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about, and you know your child best or the children that you're caring for best. And so really thinking about what could that reward or reinforcement be for following those boundaries. So here's some examples of what that could be, right? Food, activities, compliments. A lot of times our children and our everyone in our lives just wants that acknowledgement of that we're doing the right thing or we're, having that positive engagement and positive attention is really a positive thing and can be rewarding for us. As Lexi said, a lot of times our younger kids like those kind of more external things like the foods and the activities or music or stickers. Uh, they also like maybe hanging out with their friends as we get older into the teen years. Hey, if you follow curfew, that means that you can go hang out with your friends later this weekend or later tonight. So again, just making sure that we're following those boundaries and really reinforcing it, not only with some things that maybe they like, but also kind of natural consequences, which Lexi's going to talk about a little bit later about the types of consequences that we can have. Again, I love that this includes also like scents, right? Coffee or lotions or candles. Sometimes some of our kids like to have scents as a reinforcer or reward. And again, these are just ideas. There's so many. And as I said, you know your child best of what they like. And so I think it's really important to ensure that we're giving them what they like so that it is an actual reward for them. So as we talked about, not only do we want to talk about reinforcing and rewarding when we see our child or children meet that expectation, but also what are we going to do when we say that you need to be back home by 8:30 tonight and 9 o'clock rolls around? So what we need to do is first, we got to keep calm. Again, going back to Lexi's example earlier, like taking those deep breaths, like I felt like hitting something, but hitting something's not the right thing, even though I'm irritated. So I'm going to take some deep breaths. So again, we need to be regulated and calm before we respond. So again, take a few deep breaths is a good strategy, or again, communicating your need for a break. Like, I need to step away from this situation because then you are also modeling that boundary that when you're feeling upset, it's okay to take a space and walk away. Again, communicating that I need a break. I'm going to go take a step away. I'll come back in just a minute and we can talk about this. Or maybe it's tomorrow, right? Maybe we need to come back tomorrow or in a couple hours if it's happening in the morning, or maybe it's after school if it's at drop off. So, again, you know yourself best, and we do want to always follow up with it. But again, first keeping ourselves calm. And again, it may be using another coping strategy. Some people do mindfulness, some people need to go exercise, some people need to get out into nature. Again, some people just need to listen to music and distract for a moment. So again, we just need to keep calm and parent on. So whatever that looks like for you, first we want to be regulated ourselves so that we can help our child. So again, once we are calm, we can restate the boundary, right? So the expectation is that you return home at 8:30 and you returned at 9:30, right? Or 9 o'clock. And so then you can provide them two choices, right? So either this can be reactive, that they've not followed the boundary, or they're starting to kind of test that boundary. So you can provide them with two choices and let them know the consequences of each. So it could sound something like, hey, the expectation is for you to take out the trash. If you take out the trash, then you're going to get your full screen time this evening. If you don't take out the trash and we have to do it, that means you're going to miss out on at least 10 minutes of your screen time this afternoon. So, again, letting your child know what is the expectation, what they get as that reward and reinforcement for following that expectation, and then also what's going to happen if they don't follow that expectation. Again, we want to do this hopefully more proactively than reactively. But if it's our situation where they show up at 9 or 9:30 and curfew is 8:30, then we're going to have that conversation. Hey, the expectation was that you show up at 8:30 so that you could go out with your friends this weekend. You showed up at 9, which means that unfortunately you got to stay home and be home all weekend and not spend time with your friends, right? So again, letting them know what that consequence is and being aware of that. So we obviously see that, that there may be some disappointment of your child when we set that boundary, and we know that they may have a moment. So when your child or teen is in meltdown mode, we'll call it, so really having a hard time with either the boundary that was set or the consequence that was given due to the violation of the boundary, we know that as we get upset, even us as adults, our brains are not fully online. They're not fully working, which is why step one, when our child violates our rules, is for us to regulate, make sure our brain is fully functioning so that we can help our child regulate themselves in case they get upset. So we want to limit the amount of language that we're giving our child. Really ensure that we're maybe using simple things, maybe some first, then language, right? First, let's calm down or let's take some breaths, then we can talk about this. We want to use a neutral tone. So this is, I think, one of the hardest ones because when our child's melting down, we might want to get louder so that they can hear us, but really using that neutral tone and kind of lower volume to really help them regulate. And again, keeping ourselves regulated. Being clear on what we want to see. So this goes back to what Lexi was talking about of clear is kind. So, what do we want to see our child do? So, if it's that they are, running around the house grabbing stuff, like, I want to see you go to your room. And when you're in your room, I'm happy to come check in with you, right? Calm, neutral voice, limiting the amount of language, first then statement. We also want to offer two choices. And we like to call these the choices that we like. So we want to make sure that it's two choices that we're okay, that either one of them they choose. So when you're ready to talk, I'll know you're either on the couch or in your cozy zone in your bedroom, right? Or I'll know that you're um, off your phone and or you're sitting at the dining room table. So again, being mindful of what are some choices so that our child has some autonomy. And again, choice making really can help them once they're able to make that choice, help us know that they're more regulated. Because again, their brain's going to start coming back online if they're able to make that choice. And again, we want to make sure not only ourselves are regulated, but our child's regulated before we try to reason with them and either reiterate what the boundary is and what those consequences are, or have any type of conversation with our child. So again, we need to be regulated. We also want them to be regulated. So again, just thinking about how are we going to help support them in moving forward. So we know that
Can I
sometimes,
add
oh
one
yeah,
thing?
please, Lexi,
Sorry, and I
yeah.
think one thing that's really important when your child is in meltdown mode, or if we as adults are in meltdown mode because we meltdown as well, is sometimes certain kids they just need space. They just need a break, and they need nothing but that in order to get their brain back to a state where you can have those conversations, set those choices, things like that. So giving space and just you can just be present in the room and doing nothing is totally fine as well.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Lexi, for adding that. Yeah, sometimes it feels like forever. Like 30 seconds feels like 30 hours. It can be really hard. And as a parent, our go-to, or as a family member, our go-to is to help calm them down. And so, yeah, I think that's really important to think sometimes it's just space. And again, you know your child best. So what are those tools and strategies that they need to help themselves calm down? So again, thinking about, we want them to be regulated before we reason with them, but we also want to hold them accountable for their actions. So again, us being proactive as well, we need to know what is our boundary going to, our response going to be when, if and when our child crosses that boundary. Again, we know that part of learning is making a mistake, and we learn from our mistakes. So thinking about how are you going to respond and being prepared for that when you set the boundary, using connected consequences. So again, if they're out past curfew and it was 30 minutes, not taking away all of their privileges for the rest of the week. And again, being consistent about how we're holding those boundaries and how we're holding them accountable is also really important. So our credibility is really important, that if we say something, that we follow through with that, which again is very challenging. So we have to practice things too, and give ourselves some reinforcement when we do a good job as family members or parents, taking care of and following through with those responsibilities of holding that line and those expectations around boundaries. So Lexi, you gonna take us into some consequences?
I am. And so I think that sometimes this is one of the trickier parts of parenting is figuring out what types of consequences are appropriate for the behaviors. And really knowing those ahead of time is important because we do tend to be reactive. I definitely do it with my children. I can be very reactive in the moment. And sometimes I will give a consequence and then later be like, wow, that was really too much for what the actual behavior was. So really thinking about what types of consequences you are going to give based on a violation or breaking a boundary and knowing that ahead of time and agreeing if you have somebody else who is co-parenting with you or helping parent with you, agreeing on those consequences so that those are very clear and very consistent for children is extremely important. So we're going to dive deeper right now into what are the types of consequences. So there are natural consequences, and these are beautiful. You don't have to do anything as a parent. You're not doing anything. You are letting the natural consequence happen. And so one of these is my child threw the toy and it broke. Bummer. I didn't do anything. I didn't throw the toy, but the child threw it and it broke. Another one is if a child doesn't want to wear their coat and it's freezing outside, they're going to be really cold. They're going to learn that, oh, that doesn't feel good, right? I didn't do anything as a parent. The weather did it. But the thing about natural consequences that I've learned as a parent is it is really hard sometimes to live with I'll call the aftermath of the natural consequence, right? Because your children are going to be upset. They are going to be really sad that that toy broke or really frustrated that they're really cold and they're going to whine and they're going to complain. And that is hard for us as adults to deal with because we knew logically and rationally, if you put your coat on, you would not have been freezing. Um, but our job as the adult, if there's going to be a natural consequence, is don't rescue your child from that natural consequence unless it's a huge safety issue. They'll be okay without a coat for a day. In California, it does not get as cold as it does where I'm originally from, which is in Illinois. I probably would not apply a natural consequence of not letting my child wear a coat in Illinois. It's just too cold. It's not safe. But it's okay here, right? If that toy breaks, don't go buy them a new one. They will learn that, oh, I shouldn't throw my toys because now I'm not going to get a replacement for that. Um, So really just support and don't fix that situation right away for your child when a natural consequence happens. And that is the only part that you have to do as a parent for natural consequences. And it really just, these help kids learn what the cause and effect is in the real world. For us as adults, if we don't come to work for a prolonged period of time, we don't get paid or we lose our job. That's a natural consequence. And that's any position that we're holding, right? So these will help your child experience that cause and effect in a safe and supportive way. And you can always talk to your kids about the consequences once they are rational and in that brain state where they're calm. And you can say, oh, what did it feel like when that toy broke? And what should we do next time? But when they're in the middle of that meltdown, we don't need to discuss the consequences right then and there. Okay, so that's natural consequences. That's the first type of consequence. The next type of consequence, and I think these are probably really hard, is logical consequences. What is logical for this behavior that my child did? And in this, as a parent, we are responsible for actually implementing the consequence. We have to do something for this. So there's a couple examples up here on the screen. A child is caught using a device after bed. Then we have a boundary. We say all screens are put away before bedtime, right? So then a logical consequence would be you lose that device for a period of time. Does it have to be a week? Probably not. A couple days might be sufficient, but it makes sense. You used it when you shouldn't have, and logically now you do not have access to that later on. The next example is from my children. So we have a little metal shopping cart that, one of them will push into the other one repeatedly. And as the parent, I then take that away because they know that they are not supposed to hurt each other's bodies. And so now this needs to go away because we're not using it safely. And then I will bring it back and we will review the expectations on how we use it safely. And then if it happens again, it goes away. This time it's going to go away for a longer period of time because now we've done this twice and that's not okay. And I know they know the expectation. So that's an example of a logical consequence. If I've had to repeat that consequence several times, I might now be extending it for a prolonged period of time. The key principles of a logical consequence is that it's related. So it's related to the behavior, right? It's respectful. We're not trying to shame our kids. We're not trying to make them angry. We're not doing the consequence out of anger. We are just trying to help them learn. And then it's reasonable. It's fair. It's not overly harsh in relation to what the behavior was. So here's some examples of that. You break it, you fix it. So if you knock somebody over, help them up and say you're sorry. If you have a conflict with somebody else, you now need, when you are calm, when you are rational, there needs to be a conflict resolution. Usually that's kids talking to each other, like, I didn't like it when you did this. In the future, can you do this? And the other child, if they're ready, because they're not always ready, can apologize and explain their actions. Loss of privileges. So you're running around the house with scissors. That's not safe. Now the scissors are going to go away in a location that you can't use because we have to be safe in the house or at school or wherever it is. And so now we don't have access to this right now. If you are on a website you should not be on, we don't have the computer or it's blocked on your device so that you can't use that. Timeouts are another great logical consequence. So if you hit somebody, that's showing me that your body and your brain is not in a regulated state. And so you need to take space. You need to take a break from this situation so that you can think about your behavior, calm down, and think about what you're going to do next time instead of hitting somebody. If you are mean to somebody, so I say something really unkind to my sibling, or I say something really unkind to mom or dad, I may need, again, to take that space to calm down and think through why I said that and what I can do differently, and then how I can repair that relationship, because that's breaking the relationship boundary of how we treat people in the family unit. So how could I say that more respectfully? You may need to help your child with that. Even if they're a teenager. Sometimes teenagers need help with figuring out how I could say that in a different way so that the person that I'm talking to receives that message and it doesn't cause a conflict within that relationship. Younger kids, you definitely have to tell them what to do. So if you say that I hate mom, you don't hate mom. You're really frustrated though because I took away that toy. That's okay. It's okay to be frustrated. And you're just letting them know that they could say, like, I'm just really frustrated that you took away my toy. And that helps them know what to do. And that's a logical consequence as well.
Lexi, can I add in? I love what you said about kind of starting small and then building the consequence, especially that logical consequence. Like if you do it again, if you go on that website again, or you have screen time after bed again, then you're going to lose it more for more days or a longer time. And so I think it's something to always like start small with your initial consequence, because it's really hard to, if you say, okay, you lose it for a week the first time. Now, of course, if it's something really big, that makes sense. But if it's, oh, you were on your screen after bedtime, it's easier to start small, because then you can build if they violate that boundary more than one time. So I think it's good to start small and work your way up. But again, we know that some things are going to need larger consequences based on, again, the kind of severity of the behavior. But I love what you said about starting small and then adding to.
Absolutely. And then just know your kids. Some of our kids, you just give them a consequence and they fix it and they're great.
Mhm.
Some of our kids are gonna need that repeated consequence, that logical consequence, and they're gonna need it a little bit more intense than other kids before they really learn that we can't violate that boundary and that it's gonna be held firm, and really being really super consistent and ready to hold firm on these consequences is so important. So we've got one more type of consequence we're going to talk about, and these are collaborative consequences. So this is where the children are participating in the process of deciding what is the consequence going to be if a boundary is broken or violated. And so this is really a great way to teach being part of a group and being part of a family and how we can negotiate around situations. And then it also lets kids think of, take some ownership in that. So if I do violate screen time rules, this should happen. And what's reasonable in their minds. And then you kind of negotiate what you think is reasonable, from an adult perspective as well. But it is fostering that communication and mutual respect for kids. It gives them that ownership. It gives them problem solving skills. So really thinking through, like, what would make sense if I did that? What should happen? Sometimes it's easier for kids if you have them talk about, like, oh, what if your sister did that, or your brother? What if your friend did that? Instead of having them talk about what if you did that, they might be more successful in coming up with some consequences if it's kind of taken off of them. So this would be where you were sitting down with your child and saying, what do you think should happen if you don't turn off the iPad when I ask? And this is a really proactive approach. It's doing it before the actual the boundary is violated. Really sitting down and saying, hey, we have all these things in our family, and rules and things that we want respected. What do you guys think should happen if if you don't uphold to this boundary? And then you have that conversation. Kids of many ages can do it. I have a 7-year-old. He can do this with certain things, right? He can come up with the consequences that would be appropriate. Other things, no, he can't come up with those. But you can start early with some kids. And definitely when they're older, it's more important to try to get that buy-in in the process and have kids take ownership and really think through the problem-solving process. Okay, so now one more thing, and I kind of touched on this before, but consistency is so, so important. And it's probably one of the things that we struggle with the most, because like I said before, we have lots going on and lots of things that we're trying to juggle and manage. And if you have one child or multiple children, you're trying to deal with all these things at once. And sometimes it is so much easier to give in than it is to have to deal with whatever the behavior is going to be when we hold firm to a boundary. So what we have to remind ourselves, give yourself grace. We're not always going to be perfect. But we do need to remind ourselves that parenting is a marathon and it's not a sprint. We've got these children until they're 18 or older. You never stop being a parent, right? But what we're trying to do is set a really good foundation, build a strong foundation so that our kids are going to be successful as they grow up and when they're adults. And the more we build that foundation solidly when they're younger, the better the outcomes are when they are adults. So just in those really tough moments, give yourself grace, but remind yourself like, okay, I've got to be consistent with this. Otherwise, you'll see behaviors all over the place and kids won't understand the impact of their behavior and breaking and violating these boundaries. I will turn it over to Lindsay now to take us home and wrap it up.
All right. Yeah. So, really, today, what we went over is how to set those expectations around boundaries. And again, we talked about different ways that sometimes us as the parent or the caregiver have to set those boundaries, but sometimes it can be collaborative. We talked about being prepared for if and when we need to reinforce or consequence those boundaries that may be followed or broken. And so we want to make sure that we're always prepared and that we ourselves are regulated. We talked about what to do if maybe our child or children have a hard time with some of the consequences that we are providing them, or when we're having conversations around those boundaries that maybe they've broken. And again, thinking through different types of consequences. So, our hope today is that you've gained some information around how you can continue to set healthy boundaries for yourself and your families and those that you're caring for. Hopefully, you have some ideas of how to support your child if they cross a boundary. So, of course, we always want to hopefully be able to reward and reinforce when they're following those. But we know that there's going to be those times where we need to learn from our mistakes. And so, how are we going to do that? And what's going to be a proportionate response to when they are crossing those boundaries? And then again, hopefully, we're going to lessen the amount of power struggles because we're going to have clear boundaries. We are going to have plans as adults of what we're going to do if and when those boundaries are followed or broken, so that we're being, again, more proactive than reactive. And again, we have those strategies for ourselves of how to respond when we're feeling maybe a little upset and dysregulated, or when our child or children are feeling a little upset or dysregulated, or sometimes a lot upset and a lot dysregulated. Those broken toys are never a fun thing. So that is our hope for today. Um, we want to, before we wrap up today, we just have a few more things to kind of go through. So, first, we would like you to take a moment of reflection and think about what is one key takeaway that you've gotten from today. So, we did just a quick overview of some strategies and then I recapped them here at the end. So, I'll just give a little moment of quiet think time for you to reflect. And if you want to put it in the chat and share, you're welcome to. Otherwise, you can just keep it to yourself. But what is one key takeaway from today? Okay. What we'd love to do next is to get your feedback. I'm going to put a link in the chat. If you're not on your phone as the device for Zoom, you can always screenshot that QR code there. Um, Actually, you can screenshot it on your phone, or you can take a picture of it with your phone and it'll take you to our feedback form, or I've dropped it in the link in the chat. So if you can give us your feedback, it helps us make sure that either we met your needs today or gives us ideas for how we can continue to improve our training. So I'll give a couple minutes for that, and then we're gonna have time for question and answer. So um, if you finish the survey and you want to stay around for question and answer, we also have our contact information that I can make sure you all get if you have any questions that you want to ask that come up after the presentation today. I'll go ahead and be quiet for a moment as you fill out that feedback form.